In addition to those who support the show at buymeacoffee.com/Japan by River Cruise, we are indebted to our corporate sponsors. This week's show is brought to you by Ore Ikumen Childcare Gear.
Are you a dad in Japan? Do you have anything at all to do with the cleaning, feeding, or education of your children? If you said yes, you're an ikumen. Ikumen are men who aren't scared to do a little ikuji, which literally translates as childcare and culturally translates as women's work. And it's no coincidence that it sounds like ikemen, which means handsome dude, because we're pretty sure that being an ikumen also makes you extremely desirable to the opposite sex. And if you're a dad in Japan, statistically, you probably think it's okay to capitalize on that. So why not wear your ikumen status proudly with Ore Ikumen Childcare Gear? Changing mats, bottle holsters, and condom pouches, all with unique branding that says, I want credit for occasionally doing stuff that I see as my wife's job. Ore Ikumen Childcare Gear. Let the world know that while you might be wearing a diaper bag, you're actually just a douchebag. Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Dan Yoder, startup founder and guy who gets way more podcast downloads than we do, as co-host of the very entertaining bilingual The Konnichiwa Podcast, and what I'm assuming is the more popular Boating Around Japan podcast. Dan, we are a huge fan of one of those podcasts.
Hey.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
On this week's show, Japan and the world at large continue to grow ever more dismaying. But like Roberto Benigni in Life is Beautiful, we still have to try to convince our children that we're not in a death camp. We'll talk to Dan about the challenges of trying to raise a multicultural family while living in a monoculture. We'll ask, does teaching foreign values make children less Japanese? Shouldn't a child learn to speak proper Japanese before filling their little head up with English stuff? And some other questions my Japanese father-in-law doesn't actually want an answer to. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly River Cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby, this week's recommendation is a sponsored river cruise, the International Waters River Cruise, run by what appears to be a private medical clinic. They haven't given us any details about the cruise itself, other than it costs $10,000 for the trip, and they are specifically targeting business executives. The dress code is any clothing that allows quick and easy access to the upper arm, and the marketing pamphlet guarantees the passengers will feel immune from the main worries of the world. Sounds lovely.
Also, the JET program finally makes a foray into the high-stakes world of river cruise operation. Their innovative business plan is to bring in riverboat workers from abroad, and although none of them will actually be qualified to work on a riverboat, it's hoped that they'll bring about more grassroots internationalization. And they hope to accomplish that mainly by having a statistically significant percentage of their employees marry the locals. More on that later, but first, Soap Talk. Dan, I spent the last couple of days catching up on the most recent episodes of the Konnichiwa Podcast, which you are one of 3 hosts of. And I've got a very pressing question. How many times a day do you wash your hands?
Somewhere between 5 and 100. I'm narrowing in on a number here.
Can I just say, by pure accident, we managed to have had the most authentic soap talk we've ever had.
Yes. Yeah. So your last
That is
episode...
Very true. Very
Congratulations! You can end the podcast now. The last episode you talked about things that... So I should just say, like, the Konnichiwa Podcast is this bilingual conversation that happens across Japanese and English, and it's kind of designed for people to practice their listening skills.
Bobby listens to it on repeat, by the way.
Sweet.
Oh, hang on. Sorry, I misspoke. Bobby listens to one episode on repeat, by the way.
Yeah, I noticed that episode, the numbers are climbing, but...
You're going to have to check.
Specifically from one IP address in
Specifically
Fukuoka.
this
Check
one
the
IP
geography.
address.
It's a very good episode. But yeah, you talk about all different, topics. Kind of one of you picks a topic each week, and you and Maya and UDA. And UDA's topic for the last episode was this bizarre list that I would love to know the provenance of.
But
I still don't know. I'm clueless.
it was things that sold well during the stay-home period during Corona lockdowns in Japan.
Yeah, things that before Corona weren't really selling or weren't really a thing, but thanks to Corona, they kind of became really popular. But the things on the list were things like whipped cream and vanilla, and I know
flour.
those aren't new things.
Like cooking flour. Well, this was like
Why wasn't the PCR test on the top of the list?
Yeah, good one.
yeah, like you guys guessed it, stuff like toilet paper and masks and things like that definitely sold more than anything else. But my suspicion, the impression that I got was that she was looking at some sort of BuzzFeed list that a staff writer had just put it together based on what they felt like that day.
Yeah, I had a similar theory, but it was just that Yudia panicked and more or less like found like the world's worst list and then kind of had to stick with it because it was her list. But
yeah. Well, I think the randomness and kind of like the weird stuff that comes up is what makes it such a good listen. And one of my favorite moments from my favorite show, the one that I was on, was how I started talking about the Saga Balloon Festival, and out of nowhere, Mai was just like, nope, can't deal with balloons because of the time I worked for Virgin Air and crashed in a hot air balloon. And we got this random story about her crashing in a hot air balloon.
yeah, that's a pretty crazy story.
The virtue of your podcast, though, is that you do just flip from one topic to another, and that really does train your ear, right? Because you're having to be exposed to vocabulary that you may not be familiar with.
Yeah.
And also you do so in a nice way. I mean, none of you, unlike our podcast, which is we have a hard agenda and we have failed unless our listeners feel sad at the end of it than the start. Like, you know, we're light entertainment in name only. Like, you do have this kind of friends sitting at Starbucks, just, you know, pontificating kind of vibe, and I must say it's very, very listenable.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're three friends and we're sort of separated by distance, and we get together once a week to record, so it's sort of an opportunity for us to catch up, and it really does kind of feel like friends who are just meeting out. And we're also really like, we kind of have a lack of agenda, and that's a good thing and a bad thing, because our shows are really kind of I'd say it can go either way. Sometimes it's like, what are we even talking about right now? But at the same time, you know, it gives variety, and there's kind of a little bit of a sense of the unexpected that might pop up here and there.
Well, I think this week we're going to take a leaf out of your podcast, and normally we address something newsworthy each week, which is kind of us responding in a state of panic and trying to make it funny and relatable, and having to be responsive and have this nasty sense of urgency. Your podcast has none of that, so we're going to try that this week and talk about some news which is 5 years old, which is Bobby's Got Twins.
Yeah, instead of obsessing over the present, we're going to obsess over the future.
Right, exactly. So let's take a look at the news from 5 years ago. Bobby, this week we're going to talk about having kids. So while you two natter, I'm going to go and party with my disposable income.
Cool. Have fun dying alone. Yeah, I've been tracking a handful of news media trends, starting with the Nike commercial that we talked about last year with Bae McNeil, focusing on half or non-ethnically Japanese children. But also Unseen Japan recently linked to NHK did a show where they presented survey results about children of LGBT families. And it's really got me hoping that there's increased media attention and focus given to, families that are non-traditionally Japanese. And it got me thinking about, what it's like raising, mixed race children, raising non-traditionally Japanese children in this culture. So I wanted to have Dan on to talk about it, kind of as two dads in Japan, what we see in the current Japanese environment, what it's like raising children that we hope will be multicultural in a monoculture.
So just for the avoidance of doubt, Bobby has twins, adorable. I love them both to bits. And Dan, I've not met your child.
Yes.
Sounds a bit sinister when I said that, doesn't it? But I mean that in a nice way.
And I mean to keep it that way.
Dan, I've not yet had the pleasure. Could you please talk about your children in a way that doesn't make me sound like a creep, please?
Fair enough. Yeah, I have a daughter. She is 4 years old. She'll be 5 pretty soon. and she's born and raised here in Japan.
And your wife is half Japanese, correct?
My wife is half Japanese, yeah. She's very much, more or less, I would say, kind of culturally Western in that her Japanese level is, while better than mine, we're still, not native speakers by any means.
Mm-hmm. But your daughter is.
Yeah. Pretty soon she'll be correcting me. So she's like a Hakata Ben master as well, learning some stuff.
Oh goodness me! So do you reckon that day's going to come that you get a letter? There's a word you can't read. You have to go to your own 6-year-old daughter to get it read for you.
Yeah, like it's kind of weird because my Japanese level is also kind of all over the place. I'm really good at well, that might be pushing it. I'm moderately okay at some aspects of Japanese, and then other aspects that are kind of very basic, I just mess up all the time. I said, my grammar is just really odd, whereas my kanji reading is comparatively really good. So I think it already, like, she'll come back from school, she's 4 years old, and she'll say a word, and I just don't know the word, or like her the way she uses her grammar. But I'm not sure, because her grammar is also pretty suspect.
You gotta balance it with like, well, she does have more native exposure, but she is 4.
Yeah.
I get the same thing. And Ali, I think you might be surprised with like how fast that day comes. Because my girls will correct both me and my wife. They'll correct my Japanese pronunciation. They'll go, you're not saying that right. You're supposed to say it with this intonation. And they'll turn around and they'll do the same thing to their mom with English. I think they really do kind of like having both from a young age gives you this mastery, gives you this native level fluency in both.
And they sound like right little madams doing that.
Yeah. Well, I mean...
Strolling around the place. Wrong.
I should amend that and say I hope that it ultimately gives them native level fluency in both, because the big concern is raising them here and having their English level hit the same native level fluency as somebody raised in the States, right, Dan?
Yeah, for me, that is kind of less of a concern because of the fact that while my wife is a Japanese citizen, English is basically, everything we watch, Netflix and everything, we're like a foreign couple in Japan, even though my wife is a Japanese citizen. So it's a bit of a complex situation. So I'm actually kind of more concerned about her keeping up her Japanese level because she doesn't have anyone to go to. Like if she comes home from school and she doesn't know something, that's kind of like, sorry, kid, can't help you there.
Yeah. And actually, this is something which a lot of my friends who are first-generation immigrants in the UK, this is something which they've faced. Their parents have come in. Sorry, my friends would be second generation. Is that how it works? If your parents have come in while they're adults, then you're second generation? Anyway, they're British, but they had exactly that. And it's not just a language thing. It's also just not having been in that school system, right? So like a disadvantage that they might have is, well, their parents haven't taken that particular exam, irrespective of whether they know the stuff in the exam or not. It's just they're not familiar with how the school system works because they went to a completely different one. So maybe there's more than just culture, just language. It's also culture, right?
Yeah.
I get the sense from most of the people that I talk to that the main concern is that Japanese overtakes the non-Japanese language if you're going to school and raising your kids in Japan. Dan, do you think that school will eventually, compensate for the home environment being all English? Because there's so many people who try to do what you have. There's so many people who strive for a 100% home English environment. I mean, I do.
Right. Yeah. I'm hoping, but I also don't want her to have this sort of, this like complete separation. Like school is Japanese, home is English sort of thing. So I try as much as possible to kind of, when I pick her up from school and when we come home, I'll speak to her in Japanese and kind of I don't want her to have that kind of dividing line because she is Japanese. She doesn't look Japanese at all. But, that's sort of what we're talking about is that kind of non-traditional Japanese person.
Right.
And she's very much viewed as a foreigner at school. And that's just sort of the way it is. But I want her to feel comfortable with being able to kind of hold her own in Japanese.
So before we get into this issue of being identified as a foreigner or not being treated the same as other Japanese kids at school, which I think has got to be a huge concern for anybody with parents, for any parents who have children who are getting ready to go into school in Japan. What do you do to support her language, to support her bilinguality?
So, for example, for the past starting about a year ago, maybe more, I started teaching her hiragana and katakana, and I actually focused on that instead of English. My wife taught her English, and she's doing really well in that as well. But I really put kind of a focus on that, and she can read all her hiragana, and her katakana is not too bad either now. So just kind of making an effort. I don't have like some grand sort of strategy, but just really kind of making a point of kind of introducing Japanese into the house.
Yeah. I think one concern that I usually hear from parents who end up sending their kids to international schools is that they don't teach kokugo, which is Japanese language. They don't teach kokugo in international schools the same way they do in Japanese public and private schools. So if you send your kids to, if you're living in Japan and you send your kids to an international school, you might end up with like a 6th grader or a middle schooler or a high schooler who can't read and write kanji. And if you're going to be living your adult life in Japan or any of your formative years in Japan, like that's something that could handicap you hugely and further set you apart, like you were expressing concern about.
And also the pressure's on because they are going to blame you. Like I'm angry with my parents that they didn't just make me learn the piano age 3.
Yeah,
like it was such a ball ache to start when I was 15.
Tell me about it. No, we're planning on sending her to regular public school, so. I mean, that's sort of the plan, and that's sort of by design. Like, we don't want to put her in international school because sort of as much as possible, try and break down those sort of almost like expected things, because we get asked that a lot, right? Like, oh, is your daughter going to go to international school? Kind of like, well, no, we live here. She's Japanese, sort of why would she kind of thing is what is sort of the, obviously not like I've got a huge chip on my shoulder about it, but I'd like to sort of just have that be the norm.
Do you think that there should be an element of self-determination? That at some point your kids are going to be old enough to start doubling down on one of the two identities or making a decision about where they want their future to be?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't presume to. There's only so far I can kind of, railroad this my grand design for what things are going to be. And I have heard that at some point, kids really tend to choose a language as being sort of the one that they kind of latch onto. Of course, most of the couples I know are the one parent is foreign and one is Japanese, and so it's from talking to a lot of different people, a lot of children tend to latch onto Japanese because that's what their friends at school are speaking, and that is sort of what they've probably spoken Japanese with their mother or father in the household, but we don't have that, so I'm not sure that we're going to run into that issue. There could be other issues that we'd run into, but I'm not sure that that's one that we're going to have to deal with.
Well, in terms of the self-determination, I mean, there are questions of like how much do you let your kid choose their own way, and definitely most people I speak to say at some point in their life, mixed race kids tend to go through this phase where they find that being given extra attention for mixed race makes them feel alienated. And so they shy away from the foreign aspects of their identity or their personality, or they get embarrassed that their parents aren't Japanese and they try to heighten and play up their Japaneseness. But also at the same time, like, to what extent does a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old know what's good for themselves in the future? Isn't it kind of the parents' job to choose what they think is the best for the future for as long as they can? Because, like, I've considered international school, and I do think it would help my kids socialize better and get a more Japanese education for a life in Japan to go to public schools. But my girls will say stuff like, it'd be nice if we went to a school where we had more friends who spoke English. But they'll also say stuff like they want to try to eat a pine cone. So, like, what do you do?
As a responsible father, you've got to do both. You've got to gather around some friends and have a pine cone feast.
Yeah, I think talking to my wife, I think one regret that she has, I don't know if it's not really a regret for herself, more a regret about the way that she was raised, is that her Japanese isn't better. And I think that because kids will kind of choose the easy way out a lot.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think you're right to a point. Obviously you have to strike a balance, but setting your kid up for, I guess as potentially successful a life as you can give them is kind of your job.
Yeah. And one thing I can say about that point in particular is that, parents kind of looking at how they wish their lives had turned out and then creating structures for their children based on that is always the most successul thing that you can do.
Yeah. And that explains the girls getting podcast mics for their Christmas present. So, talking of things which you can do to embarrass your children, one thing which clearly embarrasses mixed race people in Japan is that they stick out, right? I mean, basically all of my mixed race friends has some story of someone saying, "Hey, you don't look Japanese," and them having to deal with that. Presumably at this age, both of them have already had those kind of comments, and you've started to think about coping strategies?
So just recently, I've always been very aware of it because I'm super sensitive to diversity and inclusion issues in Japan. I mean, as an adult coming here, I felt discriminated against in that very white person way. But I'm
really sorry to hear about that English menu story you had at McDonald's, man. I'm still with you. You were wrong.
Do you remember that joke? One of my favorite jokes that always did really well in a Japan stand-up crowd was about, foreigners in Japan having lots of stuff in common. Like, for example, like if you're black in Japan, people might think that you're scary or avoid talking to you. Or if you're Korean, hate groups might target your school. Or like people compliment my chopstick use. So we all face discrimination is what I'm trying to say. But no, just recently my girls were at a playground, and on the way back from the playground, I heard them talking to each other about how when other kids at the playground look at them and go, "Are those foreigners? Are they speaking English?" Their conclusion was that when that happens to them, they should try to avoid those kids. And those kids don't mean anything by it. I mean, they're curious. Like they want to see what's going on.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, if that's the right expression. I don't know, but there's this element of kind of desire to be noticed, coupled with a sort of and actually little known fact, I grew up in Japan. I came here for the first time when I was 3 years old, and I lived here for years, and I have some of the similar experiences that I see my daughter having. Because she's even blonder than I am. I don't know how that works. Something about genetics, but she's like crazy blonde.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. I'll be right back.
Genetics is crazy.
No, but she's like super foreign looking. So like there's nobody thinks for a moment. I literally had an old man stop me in the supermarket when she was a baby, and he starts asking me what percentage of what percentage Japanese was she? Was she 4分の1かor something? It kind of they get really they're really just dissecting the genetic makeup of your kid.
How angry should I be at this? Express it in a fraction.
Yeah. Exactly. What number could you say when he was like, "Very well"?
Carry on then. Yeah. No, but to my point is just that I think there's kind of it's a double-edged sword in that there is sort of this desire to be noticed and stand out, and you do kind of get some benefits from that. It's a good feeling when people compliment you on your chopstick usage, as we all know. But it's also kind of annoying when you're constantly, especially in the case of someone like my daughter who is Japanese. I'm sure it's going to be annoying for her as she gets older. So it's just going to be something that I guess she'll kind of have to deal with.
So there is this sense in Japan that, people who don't look Japanese don't get seen as Japanese, even though more and more so they are. I guess I wanted to ask about cultural messages that, we get in Japanese society overall, especially that kids might pick up on. What are kind of the cultural morals that Japan communicates that you like, or what are the ones that you don't like? What is it about Japanese culture that you'd like to incorporate into your child's life, and what are the cultural values that you would like to teach differently?
That's a good question. I mean, I love Japan. I don't really.
That'll do.
Yeah, right. No, like
That's all Japan wants to hear.
No, I really do, and I don't. One thing I really don't want to kind of be is someone who kind of has a lot. I don't have a lot of negative things to say about Japan. And one thing that I really do like about it is the sort of sense of like civic responsibility that people have. I think that's a really big one, especially seeing what's going on in most of the world.
Yeah.
That aspect of I think the way that Japan raises its kids, obviously there's plenty to probably go on about, but I do really think probably that aspect is the one that I want to incorporate the most, is that sense of kind of civic responsibility.
That's really interesting because traditionally I've always kind of balked at this idea of Japan looking at any kind of positive qualities, including the civic responsibility, and identifying them as Japanese traits, as going like, oh, you care about other people, oh, you Kiwol Skao. Like
sure.
You're thinking about other people, you're so Japanese. And it kind of implies that non-Japanese people can't do that. But I love that you pointed out that like you see civic responsibility through the lens of looking at other countries, and especially right now with the mask debate in America about whether or not wearing a mask is something that should be mandated, or does it violate your civil rights. That really does kind of like suggest to me that maybe there is something on a cultural level where Japan does take other people into consideration a bit more.
And it might also suggest that the whole conversation we had about, do you want to offer them a choice? That choice may not exist if only one of the two countries still exists.
I think, like you say, it's not black and white, and obviously there's going to be some, not everybody behaves in a certain way, but I think on the whole, the fact that there is an amount of care, whether that is just so as not to be perceived as being, an oaf or whatever the reason is, there is still a lot of kind of care given towards other people here, I feel.
What about in terms of things like feminism and gender equality and diversity, which some people, myself included, might say that Japan is way behind on? Especially like you've got a daughter, like you want to, I assume, or maybe I shouldn't assume. Do you want your daughter to have equal rights, Stan?
Is this the same question as the hate crime one? Should I just put them together? Yeah, I guess it's pretty. Sorry, how should I don't want to. Obviously, that was a joke, so I don't want to pretend like I'm actually consciously thinking of that.
No.
Giving a response to it.
We'll take that answer that you want your daughter to have equal rights.
Yeah, I wanted to have equal rights. I've noticed in professional environments
That's
here.
the correct answer, by the way. I've just checked.
I passed. Sweet. It's definitely something on my mind. The way I see it, I guess I'll have to kind of tackle these issues as I see them, and from a young age. The thing I talked about this in another interview I did actually, but it was just about this idea of, from a really young age here, the idea of being a boy and a girl, and that influencing the colors that you have on your school bag or whatever it is, or they really segment very quickly into genders. Anytime
the TV show that I work with regularly, anytime they interview a school club, they ask the boys questions like, what got you interested in this? What are your goals? And they ask the girls questions like, aren't you scared? Don't you want to stay out of the sun? And like they do that weekly. Any girl who's doing a martial art, they're like, doesn't it hurt? What made you want to do this instead of something else, like being someone's girlfriend? And I do think a lot about how to counteract that messaging that Japanese society gives to my kids.
So are they out in the sun all day playing judo against their will now?
I think we've discussed this in a previous episode maybe, but in terms of sexuality and orientation and inclusivity and equality, I think I overwork, and I was trying to figure out a way to write a joke about my girls are smart. They've already kind of pegged onto this disgusting liberal anti-male agenda that I'm trying to force on them to the point where like they'll be playing with their dolls and like they'll want to get married and one of them has to be the boy and one of them has to be the girl and they're having a fight over which one's going to be the boy and which one gets to be the girl, and I'll come running down from upstairs to go like, girls can get married, they can both be girls.
Hey, thanks very much for listening to Japan by River Cruise. If you're new to the show, don't forget to subscribe wherever you're listening to this. And if you're old to the show, don't forget we have a mailing list available at japanbyrivercruise.com. Enter your email, and once a month, we will spam you.
Thank you very much to our guest this week, Dan Yoder. It was great to compare parenting strategies with you. I look forward to seeing whether or not any of our kids turn out okay.
Fingers crossed. Thanks so much for having me on. It's really fun.
Not at all. Dan, is there a particular episode of your podcast, the Konnichiwa Podcast, that you'd recommend to our listeners?
There's this one, we had this guy on, his name's Bobby Judah. It's phenomenal work.
Wrong answer.
I forgot who I was talking to. No, you can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts. We have a website, konipo.com. But yeah, Apple, Spotify, we're where you listen.
We'll link it in the show notes. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next week.